Bridger Mountains, Montana Territory. November 1876. Midnight. The wind was the first thing you noticed. Not the way it howled, but the way it pressed. A steady, grinding force that drove snow sideways, packed it into every crack, and piled it shoulder high against the north walls of the cabins clinging to the ridge. Outside, the cold wasn't just a number. It was lethal. 20, 30 degrees below freezing, with a wind that could bite exposed skin to frostbite in minutes. Inside Samuel Creek's cabin, the logs creaked on every gust. His wife had wrapped the youngest in 2 wool blankets, and still the child's teeth chattered. Breath hung in the air like pipe smoke. A tin bucket near the door had a ring of ice forming around the rim, the surface stiffening even as the fire snapped and clawed at the wood pile. This was normal. This was frontier winter. Next door, William Thorpe's place wasn't much better. Single wall construction, tight notches, moss and mud, chinking that he swore by. He'd built cabins in these mountains for 2 generations, yet tonight his family huddled in their coats, backs to the small stove, faces turned away from the draft that knifed along the floor. The thermometer nailed by the door read barely 42 degrees, inside, with the fire roaring. Then the camera cuts. Same ridge, same blizzard shrieking through the pines, snow hammering the roof like thrown gravel. Jacob Reinhardt's cabin, no rattling logs, no frantic feeding of the stove. Just a low, steady flame in a squat iron box, 1 log laid on with the calm of a man topping off a lamp, not fighting for his life. Jacob sits in shirt sleeves, no coat, no scarf. Steam rises lazily from a black pot of stew, fogging the small window for a moment before the glass clears again. On the wall, a brass thermometer holds steady in the high 60s. Outside, the air can kill. Inside, he could be in late September. Now, let's see what Jacob built. Because on paper, his cabin should have been the coldest on the ridge. Everyone said so. That summer, when he started raising double log walls with a wide, hollow gap between them, the commentary never stopped. "That hollow wall'll bleed heat," Samuel had muttered, shaking his head. "You building a fort or a coffin?" William called across the clearing, half amused, half annoyed that anyone would ignore what every man in these mountains knows. Thomas Brickner had laughed outright. "You planning to heat the whole Montana Territory with that thing, Jacob? You'll be out cutting wood while we're sleeping." But tonight, Thomas's own cabin told a different story. His eldest son held his hands inches from the stove door, turning them like meat on a spit, while his breath smoked in front of his face. The water bucket by the bed had a thin lid of ice. The air above the floor was barely in the mid-30s. The difference between survival and catastrophe was 1 more armload of wood. Across the drifted path, Jacob nudged a coal with the poker and closed the stove door. That was it. No frantic stoking, no panic. The dense stone buried inside those strange walls glowed unseen, radiating a slow, even warmth. The room stayed quietly, stubbornly comfortable. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of American frontiersmen had overlooked? Why did the cabin that broke every rule of frontier building stand 30 degrees warmer than every proper cabin on the ridge while burning half the wood? Before we reveal the exact technique, hold that image in your mind. 3 families wrapped in coats, watching their breath in the air while a man in shirt sleeves listens to the same blizzard in the same mountains, behind walls everyone mocked. The answer is hidden inside those double walls, in the way Jacob used stone, air, and wood as a single system. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century, and that you can still use the next time you try to keep a small space warm against real winter cold. 0346. What did Jacob know? Turning a frontier legend into a testable question. That's the legend. A man in shirt sleeves, neighbors in blankets, and a winter that did not care who was right. Now we step out of the smoke and lamplight and look at it the way Jacob's harshest inspector did, as a real-world experiment, run by the 1876 Montana winter itself. Because this wasn't a YouTube build with a comment section. This was Bridger Mountain's coldest winter in 40 years, where a bad decision about a wall could be the difference between survival and catastrophe. So here's the question that should be stuck in your head right now. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat, walls, and air that 2 generations of frontier builders, and frankly a lot of modern cabin builders, completely overlooked? The logs were thinner. The walls looked wrong. The neighbors laughed. The thermometer did not. We can actually put numbers to that winter. Accounts from the territory talk about nights dropping to around 22 below zero, with wind driving the chill toward 45 below. Standard single-wall cabins, the proper way you were supposed to build, struggled to keep the interior above the mid-30s to low 40s Fahrenheit by dawn. You could see your breath over your own bed. Water buckets skinned with ice inside. Jacob's cabin? Same ridge, same wind, same snow piling against the door. Yet, evening readings sat around 64 to 68 degrees, and even with the fire out for hours, the room coasted down only into the mid-50s by morning. That's a 25 to 32 degree advantage over his neighbors in the same mountains, with about half the wood burned. Who do you think was still mocking his hollow walls by February? So we turn the legend into a testable question. If you strip away the accent, the beard, the frontier drama, what physical principles were hiding inside that double-wall cabin? Why did a wall that looked wrong on the outside perform so ruthlessly well on the inside? Now, let's see what Jacob built in modern language. 2 log shells, 18 inches apart. Between them, nearly 8,000 pounds of dense river stone and sandstone raised from the floor to about 7 feet high, a deep stone foundation so the whole mass didn't sink into the frost. On paper, it looks like madness. Skinny logs, a hollow cavity, and a stone core that doesn't insulate in the way people were taught to think about insulation. But that madness maps cleanly onto 3 concepts you can use right now: thermal mass, controlled air gaps, and air sealing. Stone doesn't have a high R value, but it excels at storing heat. A sealed airspace doesn't look impressive, but a 1 to 2 inch gap, if it's not leaky, can dramatically cut convective heat loss. And the tight chinking and layered walls kill drafts, which is where most cabins quietly bleed their warmth. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, pause and translate this into your world. Maybe you're not building an 1870s Montana cabin. Maybe it's a weekend shed, a van you're converting, a tiny house, or even that spare room over the garage that never stays warm. The physics do not care. The same tricks that kept Jacob's walls 32 degrees ahead of the cold can be scaled down, simplified, and built with modern materials that don't require dragging granite out of a frozen river. That's the payoff this video is driving toward. By the end, you'll understand exactly how a wall that looked wrong, thin logs outside, a wasted hollow space, and a heavy stone core, outperformed a conventional solid log wall by 25 to 32 degrees in real, brutal winter. You'll see how to copy the principles without needing 1870s Montana granite, and how this knowledge that's been buried for over a century connects directly to double-stud walls, van build-outs, and passive solar tricks people are quietly using right now to cut their heating needs almost in half. In the next section, we'll open up Jacob's walls layer by layer and show, step by step, how each piece of that crazy design worked together to turn a frontier cabin into a thermal battery. 0733. Before we open the walls, why this wrong cabin threatens modern wisdom. And this is where we freeze the frame. The neighbors are standing in Jacob's cabin, breath no longer fogging in the air, fingers thawing, staring at a cheap brass thermometer that has no reason to lie. Outside, the wind is driving the Bridger Mountains down towards zero. Inside, that needle is holding in the mid-60s. 20, 25, sometimes 32 degrees warmer than cabins built by men who've spent their whole lives in the cold. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed? In a minute, we're going to peel back his walls layer by layer and show you the exact dimensions, the strange gaps, the stone core that turned this cabin into a thermal battery. Before we reveal the exact technique, there's one quick thing I want you to do while we've got this moment of disbelief hanging in the air. If you've ever sat in a well-insulated building, wrapped in a jacket, watching the thermostat lie to your face while your toes went numb, hit the like button. That might have been an office, a brand new house, a van build, even a mountain cabin. On paper, the R values were perfect. In real winter, the cold still won. That disconnect between what's on the spec sheet and what your bones actually feel is exactly what this old log cabin is about to expose. And if you want to see how this plays out in the modern world, subscribe, because we're not stopping with Jacob's story. In upcoming episodes, we're going to rebuild his wall in a small test shed, same 18-inch stone core, same 1 to 2 inch air gaps, same double shell, and put it side by side against a standard insulated wall with thick bats and a high R number. Same heater, same outdoor temperature. We'll let the thermometers and the firewood pile decide who's right. Now, quick favor that actually helps the experiment. Drop a comment with the coldest indoor temperature you've ever seen in a place that was supposed to be warm. Was it 52 degrees in a brand new house during a cold snap? Ice on the inside of the van windows at 3 a.m.? Tell me the number, and tell me what failed first. Was it the walls, the windows, the roof, or the floor that betrayed you? Because here's the uncomfortable angle. Modern insulation companies love selling thickness. Thicker bats, higher R values, more inches in the catalog. But the boring, unsexy details, air sealing, thermal mass, and tiny strategic air gaps, often matter more than another 2 inches of pink fluff. Jacob, with no degree and a hand-me-down axe, built a system that quietly embarrasses a lot of conventional advice. Pattern interrupt. This isn't about more insulation. It's about timing. Stone doesn't just resist cold, it delays it. Jacob's 18-inch stone core, packed from floor to about 7 feet high, didn't have some magical R value. What it had was weight. Around 8,000 pounds of riverstone and sandstone that could soak up hours of fire heat and leak it back slowly through the night. The 1 to 2 inch air gaps on either side weren't mistakes. They were controlled spaces where air could warm, rise, and fall without turning into a howling draft. Now, let's see what Jacob built in plain language. He created an early form of thermal mass-assisted double shell construction. An inner shell that sees the fire, a massive stone battery in the middle, an outer log shell facing the winter and breaking the wind. That one idea, separating the structure that fights the weather from the layer that stores the heat, shows up again today in double stud walls, overcoat retrofits wrapped around old houses, and even in well-designed van and cabin interiors. This is knowledge that's been buried for over a century, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. It changes how you look at every wall you walk past in winter. In the next section, we'll open Jacob's cabin up like an X-ray, trace the heat path inch by inch, and measure how much firewood this wrong wall may have saved when the difference between survival and catastrophe was just a few degrees on that brass thermometer. 1122, not a cabin, a fortress, re-entering Jacob's build with new eyes. So we roll the clock back. Summer 1876. High sun over the Bridger Mountains, axes ringing on green timber, sap flying, horses stamping at the edge of a half-finished clearing. All along the draw, men are raising the same cabin they've seen since Ohio and Missouri. Single-wall log boxes, notched, stacked, chinked with moss and mud. This was normal. This was frontier life. but walk 50 yards down the slope and the pattern breaks. Jacob Reinhardt is not cutting corners. He's cutting lines, 2 of them, parallel. He's pacing off a footprint that looks almost narrow, stingy even, for a man with a family. The neighbors glance over and see not one rectangle of stakes, but a double row 18 inches apart, tracing a strange, hollow outline in the dust. "Too thin for a good log wall," one mutters, wiping sweat with a pine sap hand. "He's wasting timber," another snorts. "City ideas." You can hear the mockery under the hammer blows. On this frontier, you did not experiment with the box that stood between your children and a -20 winter night. Now let's see what Jacob built. He wasn't raising a cabin in the way they meant it. In his head, he was laying out a fortress. Not a fortress of rifles and loopholes, but of heat. A fortress against cold, wind, and something every homesteader feared more quietly than wolves, running out of fuel when the snow was too deep to cut more wood. He had watched German sod houses with walls thick as a man is tall, cool in summer, stubbornly warm in winter, earth cellars where potatoes never froze while the wind screamed overhead, stone barns in the old country that kept milk from icing even when the thatch outside crackled with frost. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his new American neighbors refused to see? That the earth and stone around them were already doing what their flimsy shacks could not, holding a steady temperature while the sky went wild. So his stakes marked 2 walls, not one, a deep trench under both, dug lower than anyone bothers to go for a simple cabin, because he knows he's about to stack thousands of pounds of stone on it. The neighbors shake their heads when he keeps digging instead of stacking logs. Why so deep? Why so narrow? Why 2? On the frontier, why is not a theoretical question. Tradition is a survival algorithm. Single-wall log cabins have kept people alive through 2 generations of American winters. You don't tinker with that just to satisfy your curiosity. To them, Jacob's project is not just odd, it's socially dangerous. If you act like you know better than the men who froze their hands building the first cabins in these mountains, you are calling their experience worthless. So when he drags in riverstone and sandstone and starts stacking it between those lines of stakes, the muttering gets louder. Stone belongs in chimneys, not in the walls. Everyone knows that. Windows should be big enough to shoot out of and let in light. Foundations should be shallow. You need to get under a roof before the September storms. Every deviation reads as arrogance. Before we reveal the exact technique, notice the pattern. Jacob is shrinking window openings, not enlarging them. He's thickening the base of the wall, not the roof. He's sealing corners tight instead of showing off fancy notching. To the casual eye, it looks like he's building a cramped, overbuilt box that will be dark, heavy, and miserable. But every one of those mistakes is a move in a larger system. Less glass means less radiant heat bleeding into the night. A deeper foundation keeps the stone tied into ground temperatures that change slowly instead of dancing with every gust. That 18-inch gap is waiting to be filled with dense rock that will act like a thermal flywheel. You and his neighbors are seeing isolated weird choices. Jacob is seeing a continuous heat path. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is taking shape in slow, sweaty inches. He's copying what the sod and stone and earth have already proven and wrapping it in logs his neighbors recognize. Out here, the difference between survival and catastrophe might be 10 degrees on that brass thermometer. Jacob is quietly designing for 30. But right now, in the glare of that 1876 summer, no one can see the final number. Not you, not them. All they see is a 2-deep trench, a double line of wasted wall, fewer windows, and a man hauling stone like a madman. In the next section, we'll step through those walls layer by layer, trace exactly where the heat goes on a sub-zero night, and measure how this wrong cabin turned into a thermal fortress when the first real winter hit. 1549. How normal cabins? Bled heat, the baseline. Everyone trusted to understand why Jacob's trench and double wall looked insane. You have to see what his neighbors trusted. Because out here, on the edge of the mountains, there was a standard cabin recipe. Everyone knew it, everyone swore by it, and everyone quietly froze inside it every winter. A proper frontier cabin started with almost no foundation at all. 4 cornerstones, maybe a few flat rocks in between if you were ambitious, then logs laid right on top, single row, horizontal, notched at the corners so they locked like a crude wooden puzzle. You stacked those logs up to 8, maybe 9 feet, then chinked the gaps with mud, moss, straw, whatever you could scrape from the creek bank before the ground went hard. One wall got the honor of the fire. If you were poor, it was a rough stone fireplace with a stick and mud chimney that always felt one ember away from disaster. If you were rich, you hauled in an iron box stove, set it on flat rocks, and ran a pipe up through the roof. That was the technology. That was considered enough heat for a Montana winter. Inside, the romance ended fast. Those log walls looked solid, but they moved with the seasons. Gaps opened around knots. The mud shrank, the moss dried and fell out. Wind pressed against the north wall, found every pinhole, then slithered along the wall like it was alive. You could sit at the table and feel a cold thread of air sliding across your ankles. At the eaves, the wind didn't just whisper, it whistled. Windows were an afterthought. Single pane glass, if you could get it, maybe just oiled paper stretched in a frame. On January mornings, ice didn't just form on the outside. It feathered on the inside of the glass in delicate white ferns. Pretty, until you remembered that frost was being grown by your own lost heat. The water bucket by the door, skim of ice on top, sometimes solid all the way through. Now layer some numbers over that scene. A solid log wall, 8 to 10 inches thick, depending on species and moisture, performs around R8 to R12 in modern terms. On paper, that sounds respectable. In reality, every notch at the corner, every knot, every crack is a thermal bridge, a direct highway for heat to escape. Add in the air leaks, and the effective performance dropped even lower. You were paying for an R8 wall and living in an R4 cabin. This was normal. This was frontier life. When the last load of wood hissed down to coals, you had maybe an hour or 2 at best before the cabin turned on you. Families learned the rhythm. The room would sit near comfortable while the fire roared, then slide into the 40s, then the 30s by early morning. You didn't complain. You dragged mattresses close to the stove, slept in layers, woke to your own breath hanging in the air like smoke. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they did not? Not yet the stone, not yet the double wall. First, he saw the leaks. The weak points were obvious if you watched the frost. Corners, where the logs intersected, always went white first. Roof wall junctions collected rime because warm indoor air slipped up and out, met the night, and froze along the rafters. Floors laid over open crawl spaces or just dirt, wicked cold, straight into your bones. You could drop a marble near the bed and watch it roll toward the coldest part of the room. And then there were the windows, single panes that bled heat. So fast you could feel the chill radiating off them from 6 feet away. Neighbors responded the only way they knew how. More wood. Always more wood. They tore through entire winter piles by late February, then started eyeing fence rails and outbuildings. They didn't see a design failure. They saw a hard winter. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, you need this baseline burned into your mind. One thin log layer, leaky corners, open crawl space, whistling eaves, glass that might as well have been a hole in the wall. A system where losing almost all the fire's warmth within 2 hours was expected, where the difference between survival and catastrophe was just how fast you could swing an axe. Because in the next section, when we trace heat through Jacob's double walls and heavy stone core on a sub-zero night, you'll see he didn't simply make the logs thicker. He quietly attacked those weak points all at once, turned a flimsy shell into a thermal trap, and proved that a wrong cabin in the mountains could stay warm long after the last flame went dark. 2011. Inside the Crazy Wall. Jacob's double shell, stone-filled design. Now, let's see what Jacob built when he decided a normal log wall wasn't enough. From the outside, his cabin still looked familiar. Rough-hewn logs, chinked against the Montana wind, sitting on a heavy stone foundation. But if you could slice that wall open like a cross-section drawing, you'd see why the neighbors shook their heads. There wasn't one log wall. There were two. He built an outer log wall and an inner log wall, standing roughly parallel all the way around the perimeter. Between them, an 18-inch gap. Not a random void, but a deliberate corridor of future stone and trapped heat. Both walls were tied down into a foundation that dropped about 4 feet into the ground, chasing solid, frost-stable earth. That deep stone footing wasn't decoration. It was a structural promise that this much weight, logs plus many thousands of pounds of rock, wouldn't tilt, crack, or slowly tear itself apart in winter heave. The material choices were just as intentional. On the inside, where his family would actually touch the cabin, Jacob used denser, straighter logs, fewer knots, less twist. He fussed over the fit, carving notches until those interior logs mated tight, then chinking every hairline with moss, clay, and lime. This was his air seal. This was the barrier between warm breath and the killing cold outside. The outer wall, by contrast, could be uglier. Crooked logs, more bark left on, larger gaps. It only had to be strong enough to stop wind and snow, to act as a weather shell that never saw direct interior heat. The real controversy lived in that 18-inch cavity. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had overlooked? He didn't leave it hollow. He walked the riverbeds and talus, slopes, hauling back local granite and sandstone. Granite for its sheer density, sandstone for its slightly higher heat capacity and easier shaping. Both were abundant. Both were heavy. Both turned a wasted gap into a stone battery wrapped around the cabin. He didn't just dump rock in randomly. Jacob stacked the largest stones tight against the outer log wall, locking them in like a second foundation that climbed upward. Toward the inner wall, he used smaller stones and packed earth, tamping them into the gaps, working to eliminate big air pockets. More contact meant better conduction. Less empty space meant the stone behaved as one continuous mass instead of a loose pile. Imagine each rock touching its neighbors on as many faces as possible, a chain of contact from the stove side of the cabin out to the cold shell, smoothing temperature swings instead of letting heat leak in streaks. Then came the quiet nuance that no one in the valley noticed until they felt the difference. In some sections, especially on the north and west walls, Jacob intentionally left a thin, roughly 1 to 2 inch vertical airspace just inside the interior logs. He stopped the stone and packed earth short of the inner wall, then sealed that gap at the top and bottom. To the neighbors, it looked like laziness. To physics, it was precision. That still air layer acted like an invisible blanket. As long as it stayed sealed, it cut convective loops, slowing the transfer of heat from the warm inner log surface into the colder stone behind it. From the foundation up to about 7 feet, roughly the height of a standing adult's torso and head, this assembly formed a continuous ring of thermal mass. Stone, earth, and log all locked together. During the day, the south wall drank in weak winter sun. At night, the stove pushed heat into the inner logs, which in turn charged the stone core behind them. Once warmed, that mass didn't forget. It released heat slowly, hour after hour, long after the last ember went black. In a winter, where the difference between survival and catastrophe might be a dozen lost degrees, that slow release was everything. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to drive heat into that stone and keep it from bleeding through the outer shell, hold this picture in your mind, a cabin that looks thin on paper, yet hides a 4-foot deep foundation and a 7-foot high ring of rock. In the next section, when we follow a single burst of heat from the stove into those walls on a -20 night in the mountains, you'll see how this crazy double shell turned a drafty frontier shack into a quiet, radiant furnace. 2419. Thermal mass, air gaps, and why skinny walls can beat thick logs. Now, let's see what Jacob built when you strip away the romance and look at the physics. On paper, it was heresy. A hollow cabin wall, stone in the middle, log on both sides. In a Montana winter, when everyone swore you needed thicker logs, not empty space, that sounded like a recipe for freezing to death. But this is where the numbers quietly crush the old frontier wisdom. Start with one idea: thermal mass. In plain language, that just means heavy material that doesn't insulate well but can soak up a lot of heat and then leak it back out slowly. Stone, brick, water. They let heat move in, they hold it, and then they drip that heat back into the room over hours. They don't stop the cold by themselves. They slow the swings so your cabin doesn't feel like a tent that's blazing at midnight and icy by dawn. Jacob made that stone core his thermal battery. During the day, or while the stove was roaring, heat moved from the fire into the air, from the air into the inner log shell, and then into thousands of pounds of dense riverstone and sandstone. Every degree that stone warmed was like money in the bank. When the fire died, when the neighbors' single-wall cabins crashed toward outside temperature, that stored heat flowed back toward the cooler interior, quietly pushing warmth out through the inner wall for 6, 7, 8 hours. What did the stubborn mountain man understand that 2 generations of log builders in those mountains had missed? That in a light, leaky structure, the moment the flame goes out, the heat doesn't just cool, it escapes. The logs radiate it to the night sky, the wind sucks it through the cracks, and the interior temperature falls like a rock. With a massive, protected stone core, the temperature falls like a feather. But the genius wasn't only the stone. It was the way he used air. Not the howling air that whistled through his neighbor's corners, but trapped, quiet layers of air that could not move. A sealed air gap of just 1 or 2 inches can act like extra insulation because it stops convective loops. If that thin space is tight, no drafts at the top, none at the bottom, the air can't circulate, so it can't carry heat away. Jacob's double shell did exactly that. The outer logs and chinking stopped the wind. The inner logs, tight and carefully fit, formed a second barrier. Between them, stone and small, controlled air pockets created a complex path for heat to travel. Before we reveal the exact technique he used at the roof and floor, you need this picture. Instead of one thick log wall bleeding warmth straight to the blizzard, he built a layered system that forced heat to slow down, pause, and linger. This is where another modern idea sneaks in: thermal bridges. A thermal bridge is any solid, continuous path from inside to outside, like an unbroken log end, a steel bracket, a solid beam, that lets heat sprint straight out. In a traditional log cabin, the entire wall is one giant thermal bridge. Every log, every corner notch, is a direct connection from your warm interior to the frozen air. Jacob's assembly broke those bridges. The inner shell, the stone core, and the outer shell were not one continuous piece of wood. Heat had to move through wood into stone, then through stone, then back into wood, with small air gaps and chinking lines interrupting the path. Each interruption slowed the flow. Modern engineers now do the same thing with double stud walls and exterior insulation, because thermal bridges can slice effective R value by 20, 30, even 50%. Here's the twist that would have made his neighbors choke on their pipe smoke. A traditional log wall might test at R8 to R12. Not terrible, but not great. A well-built double shell with dense fill and sealed air gaps can perform like a much higher R-value wall, especially when the air sealing is meticulous. Stop the drafts at the corners, between the logs, and along the floor line, and you often save more heat than you would by just stacking thicker timber. That's how a skinny wall can beat a massive one. Jacob's cabin, with its heavy stone core, broken thermal bridges, and controlled air gaps, could realistically sit 25 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the outside with modest firing of the stove. While the neighbors watched their breath freeze in front of their faces, he was sitting in a cabin that cooled slowly, predictably, almost politely. And this is knowledge that's been buried for over a century. In the next section, when we track a single burst of heat from Jacob's stove on a -20 night and follow exactly where it goes, you'll see how that strange double wall didn't just feel warmer. It turned into the difference between survival and catastrophe. 2851. The settlement's verdict: you're building a castle to freeze in. He was sitting in a cabin that cooled slowly and politely. Out in the settlement, word spread that Jacob Reinhardt was doing the opposite. By late summer, his walls were high enough to see from the wagon road, 2 rings of logs 18 inches apart, with a rising core of stone between them. From a distance, it looked less like a homestead and more like someone had started a fort in the wrong century. Now, let's see what Jacob built through the eyes of the men who thought they knew better. Samuel Creek rode up first. 53 years old, beard gone white at the chin, he had built 27 cabins across Montana and Wyoming. Ranchers, trappers, even the army at one point. If you needed a roof in the mountains, you asked Samuel. He swung down from his horse, walked over to the half-finished double wall, and leaned his full weight on the outer logs. "Jacob," he said, squinting at the gap, "you're wasting good timber on hollow foolishness." To Samuel, a wall was solid. One line of heavy logs, tight notches, thick chinking. That was the gospel. Double walls meant double corners, double notching, double the work for the same footprint. Why build 2 cabins squeezed into one when a single honest wall would do? You can hear his logic, can't you? More labor, more chance for leaks, no clear gain. Jacob wiped grit from his hands. He didn't argue. He just set another river stone into the cavity, turned it until it locked tight against its neighbors, and packed moss and clay around the inner joints. "Stone keeps the root cellar warm enough not to freeze," he said quietly. "Why not the walls?" Samuel snorted. "Because that stone'll suck the heat right out of you. You're building a castle to freeze in." A week later, William Thorpe came by. Former Army engineer, West Point trained, the man who had laid out bridge footings on the Platte and calculated artillery ranges back east. If Samuel spoke for experience, Thorpe spoke for diagrams and numbers. He walked the perimeter, tapping the inner shell with his knuckles, then the outer. His brows drew together. "You trap moisture in that stone core," he told Jacob. "You'll never see the rot until the whole wall sags. Wet stone against green logs. You'll have mold in there you can't even smell until your children are coughing all winter." He pointed at the narrow window openings, small deep-set slots in the thick wall. "And these? You'll live in a cave. Short winter days, no glass to spare, and you're cutting the light in half. Dark, damp, and cold. That's not a cabin. That's a fever box." What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that a trained engineer did not? Before we reveal the exact technique, watch how Jacob answered. He didn't. He just went back to tightening inner log joints, driving oak pegs, pushing moss into hairline cracks, smearing clay until there was no path for wind to whistle through. Then there was Thomas Brickner, the trader. He supplied most of the settlement's timber, nails, and tools, and he liked projects that burned through lumber fast. Jacob's design offended him in a different way. It didn't buy much. He stood in the wagon ruts, hat pushed back, chewing on a stem of grass. "So let me get this straight," he called out, loud enough for the other men at his wagon to hear. You're building 2 cabins, filling the middle with rocks, so you can freeze in a castle just a little slower." The men laughed. Children picked it up first. "Jacob's Fort," they called it, running past, daring each other to knock on the strange double wall and feel how cold the stone was in the morning shade. Neighbors began using his project as a cautionary tale for newcomers. "You see that?" they'd say, pointing at the rising shell. "That's what happens when a man reads too many German books. Out here, you build the way the mountains teach you, or you don't last a winter." Even the preacher weighed in. One Sunday, with Jacob sitting stiffly on a backbench, the sermon turned to pride and leaning on one's own understanding. The pastor never said his name, but every head in the room knew exactly which double-walled cabin those words were aimed at. Social heat can bite harder than the cold, and Jacob felt it. Every stone he lifted now carried the weight of 20 pairs of watching eyes. If he failed, he wouldn't just be cold. He'd be the lesson. But he kept stacking, sealing, and tightening. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives under ridicule. The outer wall grew, the inner wall stiffened, the stone rose to 7 feet, and the narrow windows waited for their first pane of glass. No one believed that this strange, heavy shell could turn -20 mountain nights into a warm refuge. In the next part, when the first real Arctic front slams into the valley and those same men wake to ice on their blankets, you'll see exactly how Jacob's castle to freeze in answered them with a thermometer. 3338. An absurd fortress. Extreme walls, deep foundations, and dark windows. Now, let's see what Jacob built when the shell finally closed in and the last chinking dried. From the wagon track, his cabin did not look like a house. It looked like a low frontier fortress that had lost its fort. The outer log faces rose in a heavy band, the walls reading almost as thick as a small blockhouse. Door and window openings weren't simple cutouts. They were tunnels. You peered in and saw wood, then shadow, then more wood, as if the building were swallowing the light before it ever reached the room. Next door, a normal cabin wall was the width of a man's hand. Jacob's wall, with double logs and stone hidden inside, swallowed his entire forearm. Neighbors would lay their palms against their own thin walls, then walk over and press against his, laughing at the difference. One looked at the dark rectangle of his front window and said it felt like staring down a rifle barrel. Those strange openings came from a foundation no one else bothered with. While other men scraped down a foot or two, set their sill logs, and called it good, Jacob kept digging. 4 feet down, through loose frost-heaved soil into firmer gravel that bit at the shovel. Day after day, he stood in that trench, boots in the cold mud, chipping at the ground while the mountains watched and the settlement shook their heads. He widened the bottom into a broad stone footing, a kind of underground ledge. Flat river rock and broken sandstone, stacked and pinned with smaller fragments, spread the weight of those double walls and the thousands of pounds of stone infill. It was back-breaking work for a man building alone. More than one passerby leaned on the fence and told him he was throwing his spine away on a fantasy. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they did not? He knew Frost loved shallow foundations. He had seen cabins in other valleys where winters heaved twisted doorways and opened cracks wide enough for a knife blade. If his walls were going to act as a single, massive thermal battery, that battery could not be set on a rocking table. But the fortress came with a cost. On the north and west sides, where the wind knifed down the draw, he left almost no windows at all, just 2 narrow slits, more like loopholes than views. On the south, the glass shrank to small, carefully placed panes, each one aimed to catch low winter sun, yet avoid the worst of the night winds. Compared to the bright, drafty cabins with big 12-light windows, Jacob's interior felt close, the light falling in tight rectangles that never quite reached the corners. Some settlers stepped inside and instinctively lowered their voices. The thick walls, The deep-set frames, the way the outside world disappeared as soon as the door swung shut. It pressed on them. One woman came out, blinked at the open sky, and muttered that living in there through a long winter would squeeze the joy out of a person. Outside, the ridicule echoed louder than any praise. Men joked that you couldn't see out of Jacob's bunker, so he'd never know when spring came. They said he was building for a siege that would never arrive, that those walls were so thick the fire would give up before the heat ever reached the middle. Children made a game of it. They would creep up, dare each other to knock on that deep-set door, then run screaming back to the road as their footsteps rang against the stone. Before we reveal the exact technique hiding inside those absurd walls, watch the picture in your mind sharpen. Late autumn clouds stack over the Bridger Range, turning the sky into layered iron. The aspens along the creek stand bare. Smoke from a dozen thin-walled cabins blows flat in the wind, and there, slightly apart from the others, Jacob's strange structure squats on its wide stone footing, a thick belt of log and rock cinched around it. The windows sit back in their tunnels like dark, unblinking eyes. The door is a mouth cut deep into the wall. In the yard, Jacob moves quietly, stacking the last of his firewood against that massive foundation, pausing once to study the clouds marching in from the north. By the time the first Arctic front drops into the valley, the question will no longer be whose cabin looks absurd. It will be which design holds enough heat to mark the difference between survival and catastrophe, and which one bleeds warmth into the endless Montana cold. 3753. The winter test, 32 degrees of difference. When it mattered most, the first real answer doesn't come with an argument. It comes with a north wind. Late January 1877. The kind of Arctic front old-timers would later call the worst in 40 years. The Bridger Mountains vanish behind a white curtain, and the temperature doesn't just fall, it dives. Nighttime lows drop past zero, then keep going. Wind drives snow like ground glass into every crack in the little settlement. Now, let's see what Jacob built when that front finally settles in. Cut to Samuel Creek's cabin in the black hour before dawn. The fire has been roaring all night, a frantic, hungry blaze, eating through split pine like a sawmill furnace. His single log wall, chinked in a hurry back in October, leaks light at the corners where the wind has found every tiny gap. This was normal. This was frontier life. But on this night, normal hurts. The camera pushes inside. Frost feathers the inside of the window glass. A tin cup left on the table has a skin of ice. Samuel's wife moves through the half-light with a lantern, breath hanging in the air like smoke. She checks the thermometer tacked to a log by the door. It struggles in the high 30s. 42 degrees if she stands close to the stove. Children sleep in coats and wool hats, rolled tight in every blanket the family owns. Out by the woodpile, the truth is worse. By early February, his winter stack is already half gone. 6, maybe 7 cords pulled down to a ragged wall. Every degree of heat in that cabin is bought with another armload. Another tree, another day in the snow with an axe. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had overlooked? To see it, you walk 100 yards through the same screaming wind to Jacob Reinhardt's castle to freeze in. Same night, same storm, very different numbers. Inside Jacob's cabin, the stove is down to coals. No roaring fire, no frantic feeding, just a low red bed under a plate of iron ticking softly. Outside, the mercury sits in the low teens, dropping toward single digits before dawn. Yet the little brass thermometer on Jacob's inner wall reads 68 degrees. 68. While the settlement shivers in the 30s and low 40s, his cabin holds a 30 to 32 degree advantage. Jacob moves slowly, but not from cold, just from habit. He's in shirt sleeves. He stirs the coals, sets on a kettle, and as steam builds from breakfast, he does something that would have made Samuel Creek swear. He cracks a window. For a few seconds, that brutal winter air knifes in. He lets the cooking steam roll out, closes the sash, and the temperature barely flinches. No desperate scramble for more wood. No children in coats. Just warm log walls and the quiet tick of stone releasing yesterday's heat. Here's the hidden mechanic, playing out in real time. While his neighbor's lightweight, leaky walls dump their heat the moment the fire dies, Jacob's double wall has been soaking it up all evening. 8,000 pounds of dense riverstone and sandstone, packed between two log shells from floor to 7 feet high, have absorbed the stove's output like a sponge. Now, with the fire low, that stone gives it back, slowly, steadily, warming not just the air, but every surface your hand touches. The outer log wall takes the beating from the wind. The sealed inner shell and those few tight windows stop drafts and prevent that stored heat from bleeding straight into the Montana night. The cavity between becomes a controlled zone where gentle convection moves warmth past the stone without turning into a freezing gale. Before we reveal the exact technique in diagrams and numbers, understand this. Jacob has turned his walls into a thermal battery, and this storm is the discharge test. Word travels faster than the weather breaks. Neighbors begin arriving with excuses. One needs to borrow a draw knife. Another wants to check how that odd foundation is holding up. They step through Jacob's door and stop, mid-sentence. Shoulders drop. Frost-stiff beards start to melt. "It's warmer than it has any right to be in here," one mutters, rubbing his hands, suddenly in no hurry to leave. These are the same men who laughed at his hollow walls, who said you couldn't trust stone in a Montana winter. Now they ask quieter questions. How much wood has he burned? How often does he feed the stove? Jacob points to his stacked rounds under the eave. More than half his winter supply still stands. By their reckoning, he should have burned through twice that. The numbers in their heads don't match the warmth on their faces. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is standing right in front of them, radiating out of every stone in that wall. Outside, the wind howls around both cabins the same way. But inside, two thermometers tell two different stories, one barely scraping 40, one resting near 70, and the men of the valley are forced to ask a question that will change how they build in the mountains. If one man's wrong cabin can beat the cold by 32 degrees, what happens when the rest of them start copying the trick inside those walls? 42-44. The physics behind the legend. Where the heat really escapes. Those two thermometers on that howling winter night aren't just numbers. They're a map of where the heat is sneaking out and where one stubborn mountain man quietly slammed the doors on it. Now let's see what Jacob built in terms of physics, not frontier gossip. Modern building science says your cabin loses heat in three main ways: conduction, convection, radiation. Fancy words for three very simple thieves. Conduction is the first. Heat sliding through solid material the way your hand chills if you grip an iron pan in the cold. A log wall does the same thing. Dense, continuous wood from inside to outside gives the heat a direct highway out. Tests on solid log walls that look heroic and thick on the outside often show R values of maybe R8 to R12. A modest stud wall with proper insulation, R20 and up. That means a skinny modern wall can hold heat almost twice as well as a massive log wall that looks like a fortress. Convection is the second, thief. That's the wind finding tiny cracks, joints, and corners, then dragging your warm air out with it. It's the cold draft on your ankles near the floor, or that invisible river of air sneaking around a window frame. In most cabins, more heat escapes through those tiny gaps than through the insulation itself. The log corners, the roof wall joint, the place where the floor meets the foundation, those are the usual crime scenes. Radiation is the quiet third. Warm surfaces see colder surfaces and beam heat toward them, even if the air in between doesn't move. That's why you can stand near a single-pane window on a calm night and feel chilled. Your body is radiating heat straight to that cold glass and out into the dark. Large, unshaded glass, bare metal stoves, and icy window panes become giant radiant sinks. Now watch how Jacob, with no lab, no spreadsheet, and no engineer's seal, attacked all three. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors, with their proud single-wall cabins, did not? First, conduction. His double log wall with an 18-inch stone-filled cavity turned that highway into a maze. Heat leaving the fire had to work through inner logs, then dense stone, then an outer shell. Stone doesn't insulate like fluffy fiber, but its mass slows the flow. Each cubic foot storing nearly 3 times the heat of wood meant that once charged, those walls leaked warmth only grudgingly. Thermal bridges, continuous wood or metal from inside to outside that can cut a wall's performance by 20 to 50%, were broken up by that stone core and air paths. Second, convection. Jacob didn't just pile rock. He sealed the inner wall. Tight chinking, limited openings, fewer joints. The outer wall took the winds beating, while the inner shell stayed calm. That 18-inch cavity allowed gentle, looping air currents against the stone without turning into a draft. The neighbor's corners whistled. Jacob's corners murmured. Then radiation. Those deep window wells he built, the thick interior mass, the stone rising to 7 feet. Those kept interior surfaces closer to the air temperature. When the air read 64 to 68 degrees, the walls weren't sitting at 40 and sucking the warmth off your skin. They were nearly as warm as the room itself. You feel that as comfort. You feel that as safety. In a frontier winter, that difference between survival and catastrophe is not poetic. It's literal. Pattern interrupt. Imagine a wall that feels wrong when you knock on it. Hollow. Odd. Every neighbor says, "That'll never hold heat." Then the thermometer proves it right, night after night. Which do you trust, tradition, marketing, or measured performance? Today, we run blower door tests and infrared cameras and still discover that the real enemy isn't just thin insulation. It's those hairline cracks at the roof wall joint. It's the continuous log from inside to out, acting as a thermal bridge. It's the big, beautiful, bare window radiating your body heat into the black sky. So ask yourself, in your cabin, your van, that shed you're dreaming of in the mountains, are you losing more heat through tiny gaps and corners than through the wall itself? If your hands and bones say cold while the gauge on the wall says 68, is the problem the number or the way the surfaces around you are built? Because Jacob's cabin wasn't magic. It was knowledge that's been buried for over a century, hiding in plain sight in a double shell of logs and stone. And once you see where the heat really escapes, his so-called crazy wall starts to look less like a legend and more like a blueprint. 4701, copying Jacob. Today, simple upgrades for cabins, sheds, and vans. So how do you take a frontier experiment from a frozen Montana valley and sneak it into a backyard shed, a hunting cabin, or the metal shell of a van parked under modern highway overpasses? Because knowledge that's been buried for over a century is only useful if it can be bolted, screwed, or bricked into the walls you already have. Now let's see what Jacob built. In principle, not in hand-hewn logs. Strip his cabin down and 4 ideas remain. First, he created a continuous, dense thermal mass as close to the interior as he could. Not scattered bricks. Not a token hearth. A belt of stone that the fire could see from nearly every point in the room. Second, he separated inner and outer shells so heat had to crawl, not sprint, to the cold. No direct log from inside to outside. No easy thermal bridge. Third, he made the cabin tight. The air moved inside his wall cavity, not through the gaps in his chinking. And fourth, he used small strategic openings. A few modest windows, especially to the south, to grab low winter sun without turning the cabin into a giant glass radiator at night. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that still trips up people building cozy sheds on YouTube today? You can pile insulation into a wall until it bulges, but if air snakes through every crack, your heat goes with it. The frontier version was wind whistling through moss and mud chinking. The modern version is a shed where you can see daylight at the eaves, so if you already have a thin, cold wall, what can you actually do? Start from the inside. Add a liner wall that carries either insulation or mass. In a bare shed, that might mean framing a light 2x3 wall an inch inside the existing boards, filling it with mineral wool, then sheathing with plywood and sealing every seam with tape and caulk. In a cabin you love but can't rebuild, you can fasten thin brick veneer, stone tile, or even a low interior brick half wall along the coldest side, turning that surface into a slow, heavy heat reservoir that faces your stove. If you want to copy Jacob's stone belt without hauling 8,000 pounds of river rock, you can cheat with water. A row of dark-painted water barrels or tanks along a south wall, where they can see both the sun by day and the stove by night, behaves like a modern, movable thermal mass core. Each gallon quietly soaks up heat when the room runs hot and gives it back after the fire has gone to coals. From the outside, you can flip the idea and give your old cabin a Swedish overcoat. Builders in cold Europe wrap tired log houses in a new shell. Vertical furring strips, new sheathing, insulation, and siding, all held slightly off the original wall. That small controlled air gap works like Jacob's cavity. The inner wall stays warmer, the outer wall takes the beating from wind and snow, and the two are tied together with careful, broken bridges rather than continuous lumber that leaks heat straight through. Van dwellers face the harshest version of this problem. A steel box is a perfect thermal bridge. Line it with fluffy insulation alone, and every metal rib still connects the interior to the exterior like little radiators to the cold night sky. The Jacob-inspired fix is a sealed inner shell. First, glue thin insulation directly to the metal, then build a second independent frame inside, sheath it, and seal it as your real cabin wall. The metal skin becomes the outer log wall. Your inner shell becomes the warm cabin. There are traps, though, and they're the same ones Jacob's neighbors fell into with their thick but leaky cabins. Don't just cram cavities with insulation while leaving outlets, rim joists, and window frames unsealed. Air will bypass your R value in one night of hard wind. Don't create dead, unvented pockets where warm, moist indoor air can slip in and condense on cold sheathing. That's how you grow mold in a single winter. Don't tie inner and outer shells together with continuous metal brackets or unbroken studs every 16 inches. Then wonder why the wall still feels icy to the touch. And be careful with glass, those big, beautiful picture windows your neighbors brag about. In a real cold snap, they leak more heat between midnight and dawn than any wall in the house. The only way to know what works on your mountain, in your valley, with your wind, is to measure. Before we reveal the exact technique some modern builders are using to revive Jacob's idea at full house scale, test it small. Build 2 mini sheds, one standard stud wall, one with a double shell, and a 1-inch air gap. Put a cheap thermometer in each. Wait for a clear, still night when the temperature plunges. Then watch which tiny cabin stays warmest when the heaters click off. On the frontier, that temperature difference was the difference between survival and catastrophe. In your backyard, it might just be the moment you stop guessing about heat and start building like that crazy mountain man did. 51-1-50. From crazy to copyworthy. What Jacob's cabin should change for you. That backyard test is just a miniature replay of what happened in those mountains in the winter of 1876. A stubborn German immigrant builds a cabin with a hollow double wall and thousands of pounds of stone. His neighbors shake their heads, laugh at the gap, and tell him that empty walls can't hold heat. Then the coldest winter in 40 years slams the bridge range, the wind turns every crack into a knife, and the man with the wrong cabin quietly sits 30 degrees warmer while burning half the wood. That's the arc. Mockery in October, thermometers in January, silence in February when the numbers don't lie. Now, let's see what Jacob built in principle, not just in logs and stone. He didn't win because his cabin looked massive. He won because it managed heat. Dense stone in the middle to store it, a tight inner wall to keep warm air from leaking out, an outer wall to break the wind and stop the worst of the cold. A controlled air gap that killed drafts but still let the stone see the room's warmth. Thermal mass plus air gaps working together beat sheer wall thickness. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors missed? That you don't fight winter by piling on more material at random. You fight it by controlling where heat moves and where air sneaks through. That's why those single-wall cabins, 3 times as thick in places, still woke up at 38 to 45 degrees while Jacob's sat in the mid-50s after the fire died. The difference wasn't romance, it was physics. Modern builders chase our numbers like a high score, thicker fiberglass, more foam, more inches. But if you leave thermal bridges, continuous wood or metal from inside to outside, you can lose 20 to 50% of that performance. If you ignore air sealing, a high R wall can feel like a tent in a crosswind. Jacob's crude double wall, chinked tight with that heavy stone core, performed more like a primitive passive house than a frontier shack. So what does that mean for you, standing in a world of vans, garages, basements, and drafty houses instead of log cabins on a Montana ridge? It means you think like Jacob, not like his neighbors. If you're insulating a garage, you don't just slap bats in between cold steel studs and call it good. You break the thermal bridge with a continuous layer. If you're building out a van, you focus on sealing every metal rib and gap before you brag about insulation thickness. If your house feels cold, you hunt for where the air and heat actually move. Corners, rim joists, window frames, before you throw money at more material. Before we reveal the exact technique we're going to use in the test shed, ask yourself a harder question. What's your Jacob move? What's one change that might look odd to your neighbors but makes ruthless sense to the laws of heat? Maybe it's adding an inner airtight layer over old cabin walls. Maybe it's stacking water barrels or stone behind a south-facing window to act as a thermal battery. Maybe it's building a fake second wall inside a metal shop just to kill drafts and bridges. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century only matters if it changes what you build next. So here's the challenge. Drop a comment and tell me what part of Jacob's design surprised you most, and what unconventional, physics-backed tweak you're tempted to try in your own space. Then hit subscribe, because in the next chapter, we're not staying in the history books. We're going to recreate Jacob's wall in a modern shed, wire it with sensors, and show you real temperature data when the heaters click off and the cold moves in. If you want more deep dive, story-driven breakdowns of forgotten building tricks that still embarrass modern experts, like this video, share it with the one friend who's always cold. And stay tuned, because the numbers we're about to record in that test cabin may be even harder to explain than a warm stone fortress on a 19th century mountain.